As you know, there is an existing international treaty that has established standards to mitigate the impact of visitors to the Antarctic continent. But last year, around 40,000 people travelled there. Can you describe what the potential threats are, given the land mass, or ice mass, if you like, is bigger than that of the entire United States?
Well, it's interesting. You're right, Antarctica is a vast continent. However, the areas that are accessible and the areas that are interesting for your normal sort of tourist away are actually quite limited. The part of the Antarctic which gets the most visits is the Antarctic Peninsula, which is that long sort of tail on the comma-shaped continent, so to speak, that stretches out towards South America. And that gets about to 28 to 30,000 visitors a year. But even so, they're running up against just the number of visitors whom they can take there, because there's only one side of the continent which is really accessible. There are only a limited number of landing sites that have penguin rookeries, seals on the beaches, things of interest to the tourists. And obviously, a lot of these, well, there are only a limited number of those places which you can guarantee more or less making a landing on. It's no use writing an itinerary for your tour ship and then finding out that most of the time you can't get ashore because it's too rough, for example. So those limits, along with the fact that, as you say, they have regulations that only allow 100 tourists ashore at any one time on one place, that's a kind of natural limit to the number of tourists that can visit Antarctica, and it also limits the size of ship that you can go down, because if you go on a ship with 200 passengers, then effectively in your 4-hour slot, which is allocated to you ashore, you have to put half your passengers ashore for 2 hours and then bring them all off and give your other half of passengers a 2-hour experience.
And one of those tourists was the former Apollo astronaut Buzz Aldrin, who had to be emergency evacuated out of the continent. What do you think of Aldrin's visit to the South Pole, and do you have a view on whether tourist visits of that nature by individuals who are presumably paying a lot of money for the privilege may undermine the conservationist message about what is happening in the Antarctic?
Well, I tend to think that Antarctica is pretty well looked after. The reason it's well looked after is because, quite honestly, it's been in the hands of scientists since International Geophysical Year in 1959. 57 rather. It's completely unlike the Arctic, which is a much more political animal. And the Arctic Ocean, for example, because the Arctic is basically an ocean, the ocean is being claimed, or the big parts of the ocean are being claimed for commercial development by the nations that surround the Arctic. So we're looking at Greenland, Canada, Alaska, to a very large extent Russia. Antarctica is different. Antarctica is divided up like a segments of an orange, and each segment kind of belongs or is claimed by a certain country. But all those claims are frozen. Effectively, they're not being positively followed up. It's interesting. I think what happened to Buzz was that the South Pole is actually quite high. Antarctica has 90% of the world's fresh water. It's frozen up in the Antarctic continent. And when you stand at the South Pole, you're actually standing on top of a giant ice cap, and you're not standing at sea level. You're standing at 9,300 feet above sea level. And because you're at the pole, the atmosphere is thinner at the pole. And so if you're standing at about the equivalent of just about 10,200 feet, 3,000 and odd meters above sea level, and the fact is that you've normally flown up to that height in a 1 hour from the coast, apart from a brief refueling stop. You've pretty much gone that height in a 1 hour. And I think what Buzz had was a case of mild altitude sickness. It mentions fluid on the lungs, so it sounds like he had classic sort of pulmonary edema.
And there's some speculation that perhaps he wasn't prepared as he could have been. I mean, you've described some of the challenging environment in the region. Do you think there should be a tightening up of the regulations to ensure that visitors don't turn up, as they sometimes do in the depths of the winter in the Scottish mountains, dressed in khaki shorts and sandals?
Well, virtually all the trips that take people to the Antarctic, they have very strong suggestions about clothing you take, and they also supply clothing for the people. So I don't think that, I don't think people would have problems like that. But I do think, Antarctica is a strenuous environment, and as I say, flying up from sea level up to 10,000 feet is taxing for older people, and also, there are inevitably twisted ankles and broken legs and things like that, because sometimes crossing the Drake Passage, if you're not accustomed to being at sea, then there's quite a high risk of damaging yourself, if you hit a big storm or something like that.
And finally, I mean, you've been travelling back and forward over many, many years. I mean, what are the big changes you've seen in the continent over that time?
Well, I first wintered in the Antarctic in 1976 when there was only one ship taking tourists to the Antarctic, and it was very, very expensive trip. I mean, I think it cost £10,000 for that trip even back then. So when you think how much £10,000 cost in 1976, you'll get an idea how much cheaper Antarctic tourism has become. Certainly when you go down there to the Antarctic, you see far more tourist activity now than you used to when you go down to the peninsular region in particular. But as I say, all the tourists are they're well regulated and they're well looked after. And as far as I can determine, and scientists have looked at the effect of tourists on penguin colonies and things like that, but it doesn't seem to have any effect on the breeding success of the penguins or anything like that.
Doug Allan, it's always a pleasure to speak to you.